I'm just giving thanks for this wonderful weather that we have. We got some rain. I know some of you even got a little bit of snow, and it's a beautiful day. It's not windy. There's some sun. The leaves are turning colors, and what a lovely fall we have. But the problem with fall, I like fall. I think this year is maybe my favorite season. But the problem with fall is that it's always leading into winter. And I know some of you love winter. You love the snow, and you love being out in that cold, but I don't. But there's one thing about winter that I do like, and it's this, that it kind of simplifies life, right? So, like, at least in my life, in spring, I got this, like, compulsion to get out in the garden and get it ready. You know, I got to till the soil, and I got to start some seeds and plant things, and summer comes along, and we got to get the lawn mowed, and we've got to get the irrigation set up, and, there's things to do outside, and they're fun things to do, but then, fall comes along, we got to rake leaves, kind of clean up the garden, whatever that is. But when it's winter, say February, you wake up in the morning and you pull back the blinds and you get your cup of coffee and you just look out and you say, I don't have a garden. I don't have anything that I need to do outside at all right now. I can just look at it, and it sort of simplifies life. You don't have that compulsion to kind of get out into your backyard. You can just look at it. And I know some of you work outside, and that's a different story. But like in my life, just looking at my backyard, I don't have to worry about that. And so it simplifies things. You don't have to do everything. In the wintertime, you can just do what you can. Well, sort of like that, God calls us not to do everything, but to do what we can. And this is a passage that is about doing what you can. So Jesus says that the woman who anoints him with that expensive perfume, he says that she did what she could. And he says that she did a beautiful thing for him. And I think this is something that we need to hear, because we can often get overwhelmed by all the possible things that we could and should and ought to do. And they're good things and things that we want to do. But the world is so big and life is so short. And what God is really calling us to do is what we can for him. So do what you can for the Lord. And I don't know how that all sounds to you. Do what you can is not exactly like, it doesn't sound like a really inspirational kind of a call. It's not like, remember the Alamo, it's like, do what you can. It's kind of humble. It's kind of a quiet statement. But doing what you can for the Lord, it really rests on the foundation that not everything is up to us. We are not the Messiah. We don't have to be the Messiah. And God is at work in a billion different places all at once. And our job is to listen to what God is telling us to do and to be in this place and this time with these people. And we can do that because we have that confidence that God is at work in other places. And so if you look at the context for this passage, you kind of get a sense for how this plays out. It takes place at the end of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. Mark says in verse 1, he says, now, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were only 2 days away. And so the Passover is the day that the people of Israel remember and celebrate how God liberated them out of slavery in Egypt. And the angel of death passed over the house of the Israelites and struck down the firstborn of the Egyptians. I was reading this story in the Action Bible to our littlest son. You know how the Israelites painted the blood over the doorposts, and he said, Dad, we need to paint blood over our doorposts. Protect his older brother. But, so the Israelites, they had to leave in a rush. And their bread didn't have time to rise. And so they call it the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which is also sometimes in the scriptures just another name for Passover. But sometimes the Feast of Unleavened Bread speaks of the week that follows the Passover night. So you have that meal on Passover night, and then there's a week of unleavened bread. And Jews from all across Israel in the first century, the time that Jesus is there in Jerusalem, there's Jews from all across Israel showing up in Jerusalem. The population swells. Some people talk about it being 500,000 people. They're all there to celebrate the feast. They're looking for a place to do it. They're slaughtering the lambs. They're getting ready. Expectations in the air. It's a feast of God liberating the people from an oppressor. And the people are oppressed by Rome, and they're thinking maybe this year is going to be the year when God sends his Messiah and liberates the people again, this time from those awful Romans. And so that causes some tension. Because here's Jesus showing up, riding triumphantly on a donkey into town. It's clear to some people who are watching that, he's taking on that mantle of Messiah. They're maybe misinterpreting how he's going to accomplish that liberation. But the people who are in power, they're pretty comfortable, and they are afraid of what's going to happen. They don't want anybody rocking the boat, and they want to get Jesus and arrest him. They want to kill him, but they don't want to do it while the crowds have gathered. And so they're just watching his every move. And that is the moment we find ourselves in this passage. So Jesus is in Bethany. Bethany is a town that is close to Jerusalem. And after Jesus cleanses the temple in Jerusalem, he goes into the temple, overturns the table of the money changers, drives out the animals. He just leaves, right? And he goes back to Bethany, and that's kind of where he's at. And we get the impression that, like, during this time, several days, Jesus is in and out of the city of Jerusalem. And in chapter 14, as he's in Bethany, he is invited to eat in the house of Simon the leper. That's in verse 3. He's reclining at the table in the home of this man named Simon the leper. Now, if you've been reading the Gospels, you'll know that this is a little tricky point here, right? Whose house is Jesus at? If in John chapter 12, when John tells this story, Jesus says that he is in the house of Lazarus and Mary and Martha. It's a brother and two sisters. And it says in John that Mary is the one who anoints him. And now we're told that this is the house of Simon the leper. Now, some people try to kind of solve that by saying, well, it's a different incident. There's the time that he was at the house of Lazarus, Mary, Martha. There's this time that he's at the house of Simon the leper. Both times he gets anointed, which, that's possible. But doing that one time for Jesus, coming in and dumping expensive perfume all over him, like that's sort of this really poignant moment. If every time Jesus is at somebody's house, a woman comes in and dumps perfume on him, it starts to be a little bit different, right? So, oh great, here comes another woman with perfume. So I don't think that's what's happening. I think it's one incident. I think Jesus is at this house, and Simon the leper, it could be another name for Lazarus. We know often people had different names, so like Simon Peter, he's sometimes called just Simon, sometimes called Peter, sometimes Simon Peter, sometimes even Cephas. Right? So people have different names, same guy, but could be that Simon the leper is Simon Lazarus, something like that. In Luke 7, when Jesus is eating in the house of someone named Simon the Pharisee, and a woman comes in and anoints him with perfume. You think probably the same individual, so maybe Simon is Simon Lazarus, who also is a Pharisee. Could also be that Simon the leper was the father of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And I kind of like that interpretation because Jesus had this close relationship with Lazarus, Mary, Martha. The one who you have died, the one who you love has died. That's what they say to him when Lazarus dies. I like the idea that Simon the leper was an older man, and Lazarus, Mary, and Martha were his kids, and around Jesus' age or a little bit younger. But in any case, somehow I think it's all the same. Maybe we don't have the names quite all in configuration, but it's all the same. And either way, the fact that he's at this house raises some eyebrows, right? If you think about that Lazarus or Simon the leper, he's someone that has leprosy. Now, it's not leprosy like Hansen's disease like we talk about, where you lose feeling in your extremities and then you hurt them and they fall off. It's not that kind of a thing. It's ancient leprosy was a kind of a catch-all term for skin disease that makes you ritually unclean. We don't really always know what those were, but it was some kind of a skin disease. And in Leviticus, even houses could get leprosy, like mold on the wall. That would be considered the same category of leprosy. So, but it's ritually unclean. And there's Jesus. Right, he's eating with this man. It's the kind of thing you see Jesus rubbing elbows with people that he's not supposed to, according to the powers that be. He's with the wrong crowd. He's not supposed to be there, but there he is, right? He shows up at the margins. He's chilling with the people that society casts off. He touches the leper. He stops to talk to the blind and the lame. He hangs out with tax collectors, and he goes in to eat at the house of Simon the leper. So that's where he is. And verse 3, while he's there, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar, poured the perfume on his head. And then verse 5, we see the reaction that this gets. or verse 4 and 5, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and get the money given to the poor. Now, John tells us the person who was reacting there was mostly Judas. But there's some others. They're grumbling about the waste. This is perfume, a little jar of perfume, if you can imagine such a thing, that costs a year's wages. So what's that for us? I mean, this is $50,000 perfume or something like that. I mean, you could have sold this money, given it to the poor. I mean, donate it to MCC, right? I mean, it's just, and she just dumps it on Jesus. They're looking at that and they say, what a waste. But Jesus says, verse 6, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. And then in verse 7, he says, the poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. Now what Jesus is saying when he talks about the poor you will always have with you, he's not dismissing caring for the poor and making that effort. He's not saying, well, they're just always going to be around, so don't even try. What he's got in the background is Deuteronomy 15:11, which says that since there will never cease to be some need in the earth, therefore I command you, open your hand to the poor and the needy in your needy neighbor in your land. So it's like they're always going to be there. Don't forget about them. That's what the ancient command says in Deuteronomy. And Jesus is saying, yeah, you're going to still have that. That's going to be part of your mission into the future, caring for the lost and the least. But this moment in time is different. You're not always going to have me in the same way. This is a moment where I'm about to give my life. It's a unique setting. And in that setting, this woman is doing exactly the right thing. And so the problem of poverty, that's just as overwhelming in first century Jerusalem as it is now. I mean, there's poor people everywhere. I'm sure that they could have walked out of Simon the leper's house and found beggars on multiple street corners, right? I'm sure poverty was evident. But right there in front of Mary is Jesus, who is about to die on the cross. And she responds to God's holy inclination in her heart to pour out that expensive perfume that she had been saving. She has anointed him for his death and prepared him for his burial in a way that, the women later, they're going to go to the tomb and it's going to be empty. They'll carry the perfume to the tomb after he's died and he won't be there because of the resurrection. He is anointed beforehand. Mary was the one that God placed in that moment, at that time, for such a time as this, and she did a beautiful thing. Verse 9, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And here we are doing that. And that's that moment of frustration, that sense of waste, that's when Judas decides to take action. That's when Judas is fed up with this Messiah who refuses to lead an army, this Messiah who refuses to build his platform by giving out handouts to the poor, who refuses to act like the kind of king that Judas is expecting. And so we're told that Judas goes to the chief priests, and this is the moment where he goes and he arranges for them to find Jesus alone. They'll get him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus says, you give me money, I'll give you information. Deal. It's the beginning of the end. But before all of that, we see Jesus eating a meal, and we see a woman anointing him with expensive perfume, and there's so many different things that could have been done with that perfume. There's so many different ways that this could have all played out, but verse 8, she did what she could. It's a beautiful thing, right? This big, complex story. Death is looming on the horizon. The messianic expectations. Poverty is out there. But she did what she could, and it was a beautiful thing. She did what she could for the Lord, and that's what God commends her for. That says something. And I think the first thing that this tells us is that we need to do what's right in front of us, right? Do what's in front of you. And that means be present to what and who are around you. I know this is kind of my hobby horse, but it is so basic. I mean, if this is the one thing that you take away from 10 years of me preaching here, I will be happy, right? Be present. And communion is really important. But be present, right? If that's the one thing you get, I'm happy with that. Because, we tend to abstract the world And we worry about like big stuff like world peace, right? And it's not bad to worry about those things. Yeah, sell the money, sell the perfume, give that money to the poor. But sometimes worrying about those big problems in the abstract like that means that we get paralyzed. It's just all so big and overwhelming, and we're like, who am I? What can I do? And then we don't notice the person who's hungry next door, or the kid in need around the block, or world peace. Well, what about the anger and the division that we're carrying around in our own hearts? We don't see what's right in front of us because the world's needs are so very great. And it's like that when you get into any kind of big project. There are so many moving parts that we don't know where to begin, and we can just kind of lock up. There's actually a psychological name for this phenomenon, right? When you've got a big project and you don't know what to do and you freeze, it's called task paralysis, right? Maybe you know what I'm talking about. Task paralysis. You've got so much to do, and there are so many possibilities that you just kind of freeze, and you don't do anything. Right, this is like me looking at my garden in the spring. I look outside, and I got to till the earth, and I got to plant the tomatoes, and I got to lay the irrigation, and I got to clean up everything, and there's just so much to do, and so I'm like, well, maybe I'd rather go read a book. That's task paralysis, right? And we can get paralyzed by all of the bigness of what's out there and what's around us, and miss what's right in front of us. And Jesus said she did what she could. Mary didn't have to figure out a feeding program for the city of Bethany's poor. She didn't have to solve the problem of Roman domination. She just had to show up, be present, and pour out that perfume on Jesus. That was the beautiful thing that God had brought her to that place and time to do. That was her job. Mary was Johnny on the spot. Just do it. She did what she could. And sometimes we can get frozen, but sometimes it's not just that we get frozen by the enormity of the tasks before us. Sometimes it's also because we get this idea that like there's this beautiful thing that God's calling us to do, and we're inspired by a vision of, changing the world. It's something out there. And we've got this big, grandiose idea, which can be a beautiful, good idea, but sometimes because of that, we miss what's right in front of us. I remember a couple of years ago during the Ebola epidemic. I don't know if that was the epidemic before the pandemic, right? The Ebola epidemic, if you remember that, it broke out in Africa mainly. And in Africa, there were not enough doctors and nurses to treat people who were suffering from Ebola. And we're all watching this on TV and kind of wondering what's next. And I remember talking to somebody who was a medical professional, and this person said to me that, I want to go to Africa to help them to fight Ebola, which, that's pretty noble. That was a great idea. That's putting your life on the line, and I commend her for that and commend her courage. Except that I remember when this person told me that it was a single parent, and I remember thinking that, well, that sounds good, but at the same time, like, you got these special need kids that are kind of right in front of you, and you got to help them with their homework too, right? And so, there's that tension. That's what this person ended up doing, and they never made the trip to Africa, but sometimes that can happen to us, right? We have this big idea, like, I'm going to go out, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to do this thing, this heroic thing. We're prone to think like that because we all heard these high school graduation speeches about going out and changing the world and being a difference maker and making your mark, but sometimes we got to just pay attention to this thing that's right here in front of us, these people who are right there next to us, the kid that needs some help learning to read, right? It's not bad to think big, but sometimes just like, hey, right here. And it's good to address those distant needs in one way. I cannot get food into the hands of a Ukrainian refugee, but I can give $100 to MCC. They can run a semi-truck full of food across the border. That can make a big difference. That is a good thing. We do that too. But if we only think about that far away stuff, we're missing something. And we can all too easily forget that life is lived in this time and in this moment. And life is lived in this place And so would you do what you can for the Lord right here and right now? And sometimes we call that space where we can do what we can. Sometimes we call that space and those relationships that are right in front of us our sphere of influence. And our sphere of influence means the space where we have the power to affect developments. We can impact people and events in our sphere of influence. That's where people listen to what we have to say. That's where we play a role. That's the place where we can, most immediately make a difference. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a young guy in the high school who was really worried about all of the trash that was generated by school lunch, right? There is just a lot of trash. I think every one of us should make a field trip to the dump once a year so we can kind of be reminded of what we do every time we throw something away. All those styrofoam plates that are piling up. Well, anyway, this young guy was at the school. He was really, it was burdening him, all that trash that was being generated. And so what he did was just eat his lunch and then he convinced him to use reusable hard plastic trays. And he would go in there and spend the rest of his lunch hour washing those trays. It's like just provided a solution for something that was right in front of him. He didn't solve the problem of all the trash, but he made this little contribution, right? He could have been sitting there chatting with his friends or watching random TikToks, but he was washing trays. That was a thing he could do. That was his sphere of influence. What's that for you? What is your sphere of influence? What relationships are right in front of you that you can make a difference in? Or what challenges are right before your eyes? Where's the kid that you can talk to Jesus about? Or where's the meal that you can take to an elder in need? Or the gift that you can make to someone to kind of help them along? We do what we can for the Lord. That was Mary. Jesus was right there. And so she grabbed the perfume and she poured it out on him. And part of the reason we can talk about doing what we can is because we serve a great God. It's kind of like that. Do you remember that VBS song? Or maybe you've heard it, that it says, "Our God is so big, our God is so mighty, there's nothing our God cannot do." But we're limited by time and space, but our God is so big, our God is so mighty, there's nothing our God cannot do, right? He made us, he has placed his people all over the world, and what God does is not limited. God is so big, he's working in the disaggregate, moving the world towards his kingdom moment by moment in all places and times through individual people. And so one of the things that we've got to do is just pay attention to what God is calling us to do in this time and place. Like our little mission. What's our mission for this week or today? Or what's our mission for like this hour, for this next moment? If each of us as followers of Jesus is doing what we can for the Lord, that's a movement that changes the world, folks. We got to be doing some discerning. We got to be doing some listening. What is God saying to us right now? What can we do in this place? Don't worry about the big picture all the time. Sometimes just worry about, like, what can I do right here, right now? What's God calling me to in these relationships in this place? It's like Mary, Jesus' mother. She said to the servants in Cana, right? Jesus' first miracle recorded in the Gospel of John. And she says, go to Jesus and do what he tells you. Just start with that. Go to Jesus and do what he tells you. Just ask yourself, what beautiful thing can I do for Jesus today? Right? What's he telling me? Can I feed somebody? Can I be kind to somebody? Can I be generous to somebody? What can I do, right? Are you praying over those who are around you, people who have God's placed in your life? Are you seeking God in your own life? You can't give what you don't have. All of those are beautiful things. What beautiful thing can you do for Jesus today? You don't have to do every possible beautiful thing that you can imagine. Just do the one beautiful thing that God has laid a holy inclination on your heart about. What's that thing for you? We had this neighbor once, and he had really amazing construction skills. He's very successful in his construction build business. And I remember one afternoon I was kind of picking his brain about something that I was working on, this like little tiny project that I had, and so I happened to see him, and we were talking about it outside, and in the conversation I said, well, I'm kind of a perfectionist about some things, and he says to me, well, if you're a perfectionist, you should do finish carpentry. And he's like, you got to be a perfectionist to do finished carpentry, and I'm sure that's true. And I said, well, I write perfect sermons. And that's probably debatable, but that is what I said. But I mean, here's the idea, like, what is that thing that you are called to do right in front of you, right? You don't got to be the finished carpenter. I don't need to do that. I need to write the sermon. You don't have to do what everybody else is doing. What is the thing that God has given you? What can you do for the Lord? You do what you can. And you do that thing fully, right? That's the second thing that I see here. Do it fully. Mary didn't take that jar of expensive perfume and walk over to Jesus and uncork it and just give a little tiny drop. I mean, it's cost a year's wages. One drop is a lot. Verse 3, she took that jar and she broke it, right? It's alabaster. It's this kind of stone. She just broke this thing and she poured it all out on Jesus. That's what got everybody complaining or got their attention or drew them in. She wasn't going to use this for anything else. Even the jar is destroyed. It's all going on Jesus. She did it fully. You do what you can, and you do it fully. Even the little things you put yourself into, bring your whole self to what God has given you to do. To do those little things fully. Do those little things with love, and that's powerful when that happens. I mean, that is a beautiful thing. God uses those little things that are done fully for his kingdom. And you see this all over the scriptures. I mean, just look at the Gospels. You see there's 5,000 men plus women and children, and they are hungry. And Jesus, this little boy gives his entire lunch to Jesus, the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Or that's a beautiful thing. Or Jesus, he's coming into Jerusalem to fulfill his destiny and change the course of the world. And he borrows somebody's donkey. The Lord needs it, and they let him have it. That's a beautiful thing. Or somebody loaned Jesus and the disciples the upper room for them to celebrate the Passover. That's a beautiful thing. We don't have to do everything, but when there is that thing that is in front of us that God calls upon us to do, that's when we want to do it fully and just kind of see what happens. You do what you can for the Lord. And that's enough. Right? You offer your word of wisdom. You bring your help, your strength, your money, your time, whatever that is, whatever it is that you can do, that is what is true and beautiful because you are bringing it in response to God, and it is good, and it is enough. I think about that a little bit because this is sort of what happened a few years ago when I was nurturing this idea of starting the Junior Fuse youth group, and there were a couple of us that came together to make it happen, and I have zero training in youth ministry. I never took a class on youth ministry in seminary or anywhere else. I have hardly any experience. And I used to always joke that I didn't know how to interact with any kids older than my kids, right? So I only knew how to interact with little ones, and then, we worked our way up to high school. But there I was, I had this nudging in my heart to do something for junior high youth. And after doing some discerning and talking to some folks, we gave it a try. And it's been successful. It's been a beautiful thing. It's been a great space for kids to hear the good news of Jesus and to ask questions and to grow in their faith. And what's also beautiful about that is that was my little response, but you also had your response. I mean, how many of you were involved in cooking? Think about that, right? Or how many of you helped provide the space where we meet and we fixed up that room over there, right? So many of us as a church came together to just make this possible. We all did our small thing, and here's this beautiful connection point that's happened. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. You do what you can for the Lord. And you might be surprised by how much you can do. God might call you to a little more after you respond faithfully and in something small. You might get stretched and you might get challenged, but it will be enough, and you have enough because you're offering it to the Lord in faith and love, and that makes it a beautiful thing.